Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis, host of the ENC podcast, and this is the ENC In-Depth. Today we have with us two distinguished speakers. Right next to me, Dr. Bruno De Cordier is Professor at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies under the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences of Ghent University. And to my far right, S.D.Vesterbye, ENC Managing Director and a specialist on EU-Turkey relations and Turkish domestic politics. Welcome, both of you. Earlier today, as I already mentioned in the first part of our special ENC In-Depth, ENC organized in cooperation with the University of St. Andrews and the European Institute of Peace an academic conference dedicated on the launch of the latest ENC Perspectives Policy publication entitled Threats to Stability in Wider Europe. So, in this second part of this special in-depth discussion, our two experts will focus on the role of regional actors in promoting stability or instability in wider Europe and the lessons learned for the EU. So I would like to start first with you, Bruno, saying that Central Asia is not considered, as you know, by many a priority for the EU. Yes, we do have a strategy. Yes, it has been already 10 years since the inception of this strategy. But where do we stand now? Are Central Asian states closer to EU standards, are more stable and prosperous as they were like 10 years ago?
Well, first of all, what you need to bring into account is that when you talk about European neighbourhood, Central Asia and the Caspian is what I could call secondary neighbourhood, as compared to Ukraine or Belarus, which are bordering the European Union and our primary neighbourhood. So you have that between both. Also, historically, you have to keep in mind that whatever Europeanization there was in the Caspian and Central Asia, Russia was a vector of it. So it brought some sort of adapted or modified Westernization, Europeanization to the Caspian, Kazakhstan and Central Asia. As for your question whether they are more prosperous than 20 years ago, a number of them are. The main, the prime example that I've lived through is Kazakhstan. When I first arrived there in 95-96 for a professional stay in the humanitarian sector, there was a certain situation of post-collapse crisis, the impact, or the severe social impact of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, whereas today you have an entirely different Kazakhstan with certainly a higher standard of living and a certain dynamic of economic development, which is however, not a general regional pattern, because it differs considerably. Also, inside these countries, you have stark social contrast. In terms of European standards, what I would say depends on what you mean with European standards. But the case, I've seen an evolution of the last 15 years among the discourse of political elites in Kazakhstan. Whereas you saw at least lip service to Europeanization 10-15 years ago, in my opinion, a different sort of development model has emerged. Whether it's in Central Asia proper, the Caspian, Azerbaijan, and I call that the Dubaiization of the development model. It even affects the way cities are organized and the visual landscape of the countries and economies and their capitals in question. What do I mean by Dubaiization? It is a model that clearly favors infrastructural development, economic growth, etc., based on the experience that you see in part of the Persian Arab Gulf, Dubai, Qatar, or similar places that have evolved into hubs. But especially what makes it attractive, I think, for elites and part of the oligarchies in these countries, that is that this model shows somehow that you can have economic development, you can have modernization, access to consumer goods, etc., and while all the same remaining some sort of autocracy.
Okay, speaking about different models of governance for Central Asian states, I'm just moving a little bit westwards, not too far geographically speaking, to Turkey and to you, Samuel. So, at some point, Turkey developed strong ties with Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, based on strong ties, cultural, for example. and replace Iran in that sense. And it was an opportunity for the EU at some point to use an accession country like Turkey to lure the Central Asian states closer to our own standards, the EU standards. Do you think that this window of opportunity is lost? Do you think that the model that Turkey used to have is gone? Is the situation irreversible according to your opinion?
I think the ties that you're referring to between Turkey and Central Asia, I mean, of course, they go back quite far historically. They have a very important geographic, ethnic, linguistic, historical connection that links most Central Asian countries with Turkey in many different respects. And I think with Azerbaijan, it's the most obvious case, but it can also be emulated, and you can see the similarities also with Uzbekistan and the other Central Asian countries. But for example, with when it comes to Azerbaijan, it's obvious that these ties are very, very close and have been so for a long time. They vote often at UN level, and when it comes to dealing diplomatically, both bilaterally and multilaterally with other countries, they work together. They vote together, sometimes often in international institutions. And for example, just to give a more recent reference, when the failed coup took place last year, some of the first people to contact Turkey and its government were its neighboring Azeris. So there's a kinship and a very, very strong tie which exists and which is used regularly. But that's Azerbaijan. When it comes to the rest, or when it comes to Central Asia, those ties aren't as developed as they are with Azerbaijan. And I think specifically the case of Turkey, Central Asia was an attempted development in the 1990s under the coalition government of Erbakan and Tansu Çiller, in which they attempted to create a Turkic notion of foreign policy, which was, again, popularized during Demirel and Tansu Çiller and Erbakan during the 1990s, and with limited success. It was a lot of excellent ideas, and at the time the EU wasn't as involved in the process as they might have wished to be later in the 2000s, but at the time it didn't quite materialize as well as expected. And one of the reasons was a multitude of reasons why it didn't work so well. One of them was, and that's a repeating issue that you'll see appearing again and again today as well, is that Turkey was unstable. Turkey had its, they called it the non-bloody or non-militaristic coup in '96. Then they ran into a lot of economic issues in the early 2000s. And all of these factors put together really just led to a deflation of developments, which could have been something else.
Staying still in issues related to good governance, but moving back to Central Asia. In this report, the two authors that dealt with Central Asia, Sarbek Jurayev and Karolina Kluzhevska, they stressed out that long-term stability of the region cannot be pursued without addressing some less visible yet critical problems. And they outlined three critical areas. These are education, economy and equality, as a way to promote stability and prosperity and as a means to fight radicalization. But the real question is how to attract the interest of the governments. Why I'm asking that? In the recent European Council conclusions on the EU Central Asia strategy, it was mentioned that, once more, that the depth of relations is linked to the ambitions and needs of the individual Central Asian states. So how can we attract the authorities in each of the Central Asian states so as to work closer with us on these issues?
Well, in any case, a key problem socio-economically that is faced by, well, yes, shall we say, all of those states is the high degree of monopolization of control on key sectors of the economy. What do I mean by that? It is actually a quite small group with oligarchies that exert control over these sectors through influence and positions, or on the interface of market and state, and the state bureaucracy. And they use also the state and the juridics, etc., to continue sustain their monopolies, which is a major impediment on the development of small and medium enterprises, who operate very often in the informal economy, which is also there. It is actually a major impediment on the economic dynamic and potential that is certainly there. Now, the situation is recognized more in some countries than others. Again, Kazakhstan is leading the way. And how to attract the interest of governments? I don't think that the interest of incumbent governments will be attracted so much by external intervention. They will feel it themselves, because, I mean, when you take the political elites of these states, they are of course no homogeneous bloc. You have different fractions, you have generations, etc. And for example, within the bureaucratic systems of these states, there are groups, fractions, certain generations who are very aware of this and may seize a window of opportunity that can come up in any time in the future to push through that agenda. I have actually quite some faith in internal dynamics within these regimes, rather than more than in external pressure or than in classical opposition.
What do you mean by that? I mean, you have faith in terms of like restructuring themselves, like changing what, I mean, they have influences like by pouring money a lot on investing on issues related to border management. Most of the money that is coming from non-EU is coming from China, for example, on development.
Look, well, all these states and economies and societies have a large informal or semi-formal economy. You don't need to invent it. It is there, it is active, it is crucial in the daily run of affairs. I mean, also at governance level, they're quite aware of its importance. Any reform towards that will include legalizing or streamlining that sector, giving it a place in the economy in general, and actually reforming it into a taxable base, which might benefit the state as well.
Okay. I would like to draw your attention, Samuel, on the issue of de-radicalization. In your chapter, you rightly pointed out that in the chapter of Kurds, Europe and Turkey's regional window of opportunity, you...
This is one of different subjects, no longer Central Asia.
No. Okay. We're changing subject and we're talking about the radicalization in Turkey. And I quote something from your chapter. You mentioned that it's difficult to imagine a future in which radicalized Kurds remain completely sidelined or simply decide overnight to deassociate themselves organically from terrorist organizations. My question to you is like, what Ankara needs to do in order to avoid such a grim scenario, and is there any room for cooperation with the EU on this issue?
So that sentence, read out of context, could give the impression that I'm referring to all Kurds somehow being affiliated to a terrorist organization, which is a far removed case. I'm referring to within Turkey, a very small minority. Within Syria, a much more sizable plurality. And within the context of the Syrian conflict, looking at the Kurdish political and militarized party that are currently occupying the important positions of power, let's say, within the Syrian context, what I argue in the piece is that it's very, very important for Ankara, but also for the EU, and arguably also other patrons, like for example Russia and the US, to really have some foresight in terms of what can be done in the de-radicalization process of these groups. Let me add something else to that. The idea of, I mean, in the current situation, it's of course in the YPJs and other terrorist organizations or related terrorist organizations or radical groups' interest to continue their moves towards autonomy in Syria. However, on the long term, number one, it's very likely that a proportion at least of these factions, will want peace, stability, and economic prosperity. The question then is, who is going to fill that vacuum or provide that, in brackets, service? And that is potentially the EU, considering the EU is a major, the largest donor in terms of foreign development aid still in Syria, with Germany to a lesser degree, but France and also the UK very interested, with vested interest in Syria, and have an interest in continuing or promoting trade within the country and stabilizing the country in a post-conflict reconstruction scenario. Again, mentioning the EU with its previous quite successful models based around autonomous and preferential trade agreements, which can de-radicalize immensely and hopefully also successfully. And of course, coming to Ankara, Ankara is considers it a red line, doesn't want to negotiate or deal with these factions, or at least some of them, because the complexity of the factions within Syria is rife. There are of course many factions that are linked to the Barzani group within Iraq that are heavily allied, both economically and politically, to Turkey. But there are also many other factions, as mentioned before, that are considered outright terrorist organizations by Ankara. And the key here, which I also argue, is to see how Ankara can formulate a more sustainable long-term method of de-radicalize parts of those hostile organizations to either align them with their supporters under the Barzani model or create other patterns of cooperation that will create a stability in Ankara's neighborhood.
Can I take the opportunity and ask you, I would like to dig in more in this Barzani model. Could you please elaborate a little bit on this model and how it can be applied?
Well, the Barzani model is a very, very curious case of international relations success, let's call it, or regional success in an area in which previously might have been considered impossible, which means northern Iraq, which is primarily controlled by the Barzani tribe and Barzani himself under the KRG, has aligned with Turkey since the last 5 to 7 years, both in terms of investments in energy, reconstruction, construction, airports, really kind of a large array of different kind of economic developments which have facilitated relations between Ankara and Erbil especially. This model hopefully can be emulated within a Syrian context through trade agreements and through the willingness of Ankara.
Thank you. Staying on the issue of radicalization, we'll move to the topic of returning fighters. Several scholars suggest that Russia, when it comes to Central Asian fighters, is not part of the solution of political Islam radicalization, but rather part of the problem. Most Central Asian recruits are radicalized while temporarily staying in Russia, not in their home countries. So, my question to you, Bruno, is how does the Russian influence in Central Asia affect political Islam? And this question is also for you, Samuel. Does this issue can be a common ground for Central Asian states and Turkey, like to work together, maybe have a platform in which they can exchange information and best practices, a platform in which the EU can also be part? Just a thought that I had. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer first. It's a pretty easy one from my perspective, which is yes. The one thing, despite a lot of difficulties in the Turkey-EU relationship, that continues to this day within meetings, interinstitutional meetings to work, is the common agreement that counter-terrorism is of vital importance, remains a top-tier priority, and that we need to work with regional actors, not only Turkey but also Central Asians, on countering terrorism and foreign fighters. So, yes, I mean, that's an easy, straightforward answer, absolutely.
In terms of radicalization in Central Asia and the Caspian region, the thing is, the line of radicalization is something that I've been hearing for the last 20 years. Yes, Central Asia and the Caspian as a hotbed of Islamic radicalizations. Whereas save maybe for a variation during the Tajik civil war, which was micro-regional and part of it was mobilized through some form of political Islam, what we have seen is that so far no political or social unrest that there have been has been ideologized or channelized by groups of political Islamist orientation. Now, in terms of returning fighters, that is always possible. Yes, don't forget you deal with a region where, for a long time, regional governments have been sort of instrumentalizing this issue of radicalization in order to legitimize themselves, also internationally, and to sort of legitimize their staunch secularist stance, and so on. The most obvious example is the way this has been done in Tajikistan. Objectively, fringe radicalization is possible, whereas I see now quite a focus on Islamic State or Islamic State affiliated groups in the Central Asian Caspian countries. I've been hearing this before. Like about 6-7 years ago, the discourse was all about Hizb ut-Tahrir, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Hizb ut-Tahrir, as some sort of apparently or perceivedly omnipresent political movement. And have you noticed that hardly anybody talks about it anymore? You know, there's a whole discourse that have been developed among that. Now, okay, whether it is there or not in terms of radical groups, the key question is whether they will manage to find a sufficient social base and social following, and whether they can pick into a certain political change that can be either social unrest or that can be some sort of power struggle within the state itself. That is the key question, much more than the presence of radicalized individuals or groups itself, because that's the key to stabilization or destabilization.
Let me also add, because I think here we're referring to radicalization from an Islamic perspective, Islamic terrorism and so forth. But of course, within the context of my article, there's also a large degree of talk about de-radicalization of Syrian Kurds. So that's also of great interest, but that also enhances the complexity of how do you de-radicalize Kurdish groups, and what does that mean in terms of Kurdish foreign fighters coming back to Europe, with training, capacity. What does that mean for European member states? Recently, I spoke to a counter-terrorist expert in Switzerland who informed me about the radicalization issue of Kurdish returning fighters and what that means in terms of a threat for national and European security. So there's also that whole dimension, which poses a real question that we're not talking about much either. And then on the other spectrum, there's also the fact that the EU at the moment is providing some quite adequate funding, which can also either already be used or potentially be used for anti-radicalization programs under the context of de-radicalizing certain Kurdish groups, especially when it comes to youth Kurdish groups that have been radicalized both within Turkey but potentially also within Syria.
Okay. Well, what we should not forget or oversee that is that you deal in terms of the southern rimland of the old Soviet Union with a number of societies that are still in a process of redefining their societal and national identities. And it will be very interesting to see what will come out of that, whether it's some sort of new state-driven patriotism, neo-traditionalism. In any case, an Islamic component will be there as well, because it is part of both majority ethnic identity and historical identities. So that will certainly be there. And one should not assume that any new identity that will come up will be defined by liberal democracy. Because we are in a phase of modernity, of history, where the universality of liberal values and of market democracy is being contested more and more. In the Islamic sphere, in the Arab world, but in Africa, but also in a number of successor states of what used to be the Soviet Union. And that is a reality we will have to cope with.
I see. At this point, I would like to both of you ask you. The aim of this report was to provide some recommendations to the EU on how to tackle the threats coming from wider Europe. So I would like, from your side, to tell me, when it comes to Turkey, when it comes to Central Asia, what are the lessons learned and which are the key elements that EU should focus on its policy in the coming year and years?
Do you want to start? Or shall I start? It's a very wide question. It's a difficult question. Turkey faces a lot of instability. Turkey is in an extremely, we talk about European instability, but let's also talk about Turkish instability. Turkey is in a geographical position. It is in a hotspot. It's an unlucky country in some respects. Right? It's no Sweden. Let's put it like that. And sometimes we forget that. I see it often when we deal with Turkey. Let's say in terms of research, think tanks, diplomatically, we sometimes forget, God, they're not in such an easy position, right? They face terrorism directly from Islamic State. They face PKK terrorism. They have, let's call it very politely, bad neighbors or unstable neighbors. And they also, just to link it back to the EU as well, considering that the EU and Turkey continue to be, for the time being at least, within the accession process, Turkey feels heavily betrayed or let down. That's a different discussion whether it's true or not. There's a whole discussion to be had about that accession process, and I'll leave that for another podcast. But that's the sentiment that Turkey faces, and within that sentiment, it faces a lot of instability that then rub off on the European Union. So I think, in terms of what the EU can do in terms of decrease its instability or its threats to stability, one thing is creating and cementing a stronger relationship with a long-standing NATO partner, which is Turkey. That is, without a doubt, a very, very possible and very important solution to part of these problems. And it doesn't just relate to counter-terrorism, but it also relates to, we mentioned before as well, the reforming and modernization of the customs union. Probably one of the most important trade union agreements between the EU and a close neighborhood ally being Turkey. Beyond that, as I also mentioned in the report, there is, of course, the factor of Syria. Syria continues and will play a detrimental role for counterterrorism and migration security for the European Union. And the migration deal that we have with Turkey, despite its unpopularity, has, if we look at the numerics, gone from refugee migration flows in the thousands last year down to about 158 if we look at the recent counts. So it's clear that the relationship with Turkey, despite the instability, despite the difficulties, remains vital.
Well, I don't see any direct threat coming from the Central Asian Caspian region towards the EU, as compared to what is fermenting beyond or south of the Mediterranean, as we know. Well, yes, that's what I consider.
It doesn't have to be like threats. Maybe what kind of challenge we have. Since it was mentioned just a couple of days ago that we'll have a new strategy by the end of 2019. So, what are the steps that we should...
First of all, the primary dynamic of Central Asia and the Caspian will be with Russia. Let's recognize that. Secondly, from the EU side, I would not underestimate the capacity of the incumbent oligarchies, also these societies, to get their act together eventually themselves. Whether it's through periods of turbulence or not, but that is definitely there. And then third, in the middle, actually, to take a more larger view, a future view in terms of economic geography, and in terms of trade, including in raw materials, agro-industrial sector, etc. I think a European entity, the EU, could benefit much more from a modus vivendi with Russia and the Caspian Central Asian region than it does with Africa or the Persian Arab Gulf, for example. That's how I see it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your contribution to both the conference and to this very interesting in-depth discussion. I'm Andreas Marazis, and that was the second part of our special in-depth ENC.